Welcome back, Honors. All right, welcome back on this weekend flip. Also, gonna go ahead and throw this out there and say congrats to all the Rummel supporters, right? The Chapelettes and all y'all for winning state and whatnot. I heard it was a big game. I heard it was a good game, and I'm glad that y'all got a chance to be there. And I don't think those boys would have had a shot had y'all not have been there. So, good job, right? Now, anyway, we left off on our last flip talking about a lot of different stuff. And we're going to take some time as it's going throughout the week to review all this Reformation stuff. But the reason why we're pushing through this really heavy is because y'all have learned a lot about this stuff in religion class already, right? Something I'm going to go ahead and say, though, is, oh, God, calm down. Before Monday, okay, before Monday, make sure you go back and you know a select number of key people, all right? You understand what I'm saying? Make sure you know the following key people, all right? You ready? Make sure you know who Jan Hus is. Make sure you know who John Wycliffe is. Make sure you know who Leo X is. Make sure you know who Johann Tetzel is. Make sure you know who... Those are probably the big four right there. Oh, and Erasmus. Make sure you know who Erasmus is, right? Those 5 people are wildly important, all right? So, because they'll be in, like, your big, your part of your section of your test next week on Friday, right? So, they'll be definitely up in the matching portion. Now, the other big one that you need to make sure you know before Monday is, of course, this guy, right? Now, the thing about this guy is... a lot of historical lies and nonsense said about this dude for a long time, right? So a lot of you already know who he is, right? This is none other than the Martin Luther, right? The young German monk who decides to shake up everything in Europe when he decides to, like, have 95 very controversial ideas, right? Well, let's give him a little background first, though, right? The dude just didn't pop up out of nowhere, all right? So biggest thing about Martin Luther is... he is from what you would call Germany, right? But the thing about being from Germany is very subjective, right? Because you need to jot this down. Germany didn't exist, all right? Germany at the time, and I know Allison right now is saying it on her own, was called the Holy Roman Empire, right? So the Holy Roman Empire was a massive area in the middle of Europe, right? That took up a lot of like modern day countries, right? So the Holy Roman Empire. When we talked about the Holy Roman Empire briefly, we talked about how Charlemagne was the very first person to rule over this thing and be crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, there's a lot of debate about that. There's a huge amount of debate about that, actually. But this is what the Holy Roman Empire is. Look at all this stuff. It's this gigantic conglomerated, like, mushing of different territories and modern-day countries, right? The big countries today that it contains inside of it are the following, all right? Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Poland, and Austria, right? So those 6 countries all existed inside of the Holy Roman Empire, right? So as you can see, there are these giant... oh, and I could keep going, too. I could keep going. The Czech Republic's in there. Luxembourg's in there. Like, it's like a ton of different areas. Liechtenstein, like a northern Italy is there. I mean, like, it's a huge country. So there was no necessarily... thing called Germany, even though that is the language that this cat, Luther, spoke, right? So something you need to know is that he is considered ethnically German, right? So he's a young German monk, right? Who originally was the son of a lawyer, right? So son of a lawyer and decides to take up the family business and to go join a university in Wittenberg, Germany, right? And he decides that he's going to go, excuse me, he's going to go off and he's going to become a lawyer himself. Now, in the process of studying, we start to see a lot of different personality things of Martin Luther begin to come forward, right? So Martin Luther happens to be a very manic guy, right? So very manic, very paranoid. Like a lot of people just see him as this stoic, serious, kind of guy. He's actually not. It's a very manic cat, right? So some people have even argued that he may have been mildly schizophrenic, all right? So like some people argue that he might have had some kind of paranoid delusional issue, right? So, well, I don't necessarily believe it's that extreme, but he was a ridiculously faithful person, right? Martin Luther would go to confession sometimes multiple times a day, right? until the point where one of his, the priests at the church that he went to all the time to confess was like, dude, you need to calm down. Like, I mean, like, you're overdoing this a little bit. And Martin Luther confesses to him. He's like, I don't think you understand. Like, I'm so petrified of evil and the concept of hell, right? So he tells him to go off and read, just read as much of the Bible as he can get his hands on, but particularly read a lot of St. Paul, which is something that was allowed to be translated into vernacular language at the time, because he couldn't read the Bible necessarily because he didn't actually fluently speak Latin. And so he goes off and he starts reading it, and he starts forming a lot of ideas. And he starts looking at these letters from St. Paul, you know, who was a redeemed person himself when he was actually blinded by Christ and everything like that. He starts to read these things, and he starts to see, you know, there's some stuff going on in the church that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? There's some corruption, there's some sketchy stuff going on. And in this process of study, he at one point then is sitting in a study and he has to go back across the street to go into the university, and a thunderstorm pops up, right? And he's petrified of lightning. Like I said, he's a paranoid guy, right? He's so afraid of lightning. He's freaking out. And then he tries to run outside, and then he hears a big clap of thunder, and he gets down on his knees and he says, Saint Anne, if you save me from this terrible, terrifying danger, I will become a priest in your church. And he just doesn't die from the lightning storm, so he becomes a monk, right? So he commits himself to religious study, and in this process, he eventually becomes a professor of theology himself, right? And he starts to summarize a lot of his ideas. And right around the time that Johann Tetzel starts selling these indulgences to finance Pope Leo X's debts and his St. Peter's fix-up projects, he starts to freak out. So go ahead and write a Martin Luther, a young German priest, right? So now, Martin Luther, the young German priest, spoke out against this, but initially, no one listened. So he starts to kind of get a little fired up, and he's like, you know what? I'm going to outline all of my theories in a document. I'm going to write all 95 issues I have with the Catholic Church currently down in a document, right? And he calls this thing the 95 Theses, right? Now, really, really quick, and says right here, one of the most pivotal events, one of the most groundbreaking things, one of the things that is used almost commonly as a clue on jeopardy is the fact that he eventually, in 1517, went up to the Wittenberg Castle Church and nailed the 95 Theses to the door of that church. Womp, womp, wah, 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 wah. Turns out that probably never happened. All right, so really, really quick, I hate to like hurt your feelings or break your brain or like kind of go against what a lot of history teachers have been telling you up to this point. But the chances are is that Martin Luther never actually nailed that document to that church door, right? So it would have been too dramatic, right? Like it would have been much too, like, it didn't really match like any of his personality traits. Not to mention the fact too that like it would also be considered something punishable possibly by torture or being considered a heretic. So he actually writes these ideas down with no intention of starting a new religion. He never considered to be himself to be a reformer to that extent, or he never planned on being the first Protestant leader. He just wanted to write these things down, and so he wrote them all down. He sent them in a letter to an archbishop, right? And so it was actually just a letter. It was just a letter, right? So he probably never actually did this, right? So, but just the fact of the matter is that this archbishop ends up with this document in front of him called the 95 Theses that does a lot of crazy stuff. It disapproves of indulgences, right? It says that they should not be sold, and it lays out this entire thing. It criticizes the Pope and the power of which that they are taking on. It looked down on the church and actually like accused the church of doing like wrong things. And then also not to mention the fact too that he also went as far in his 95 Theses to say there is no difference ethically or personably from a priest and a lay person, right? Like, so he's saying that we're all together in a brotherhood of the church, right? That we are all like a part of the priesthood of the church because we all exist for God and in his name. So it's a very, 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 very intense document. And the archbishop gets it, and he's like, oh, dang. And then he starts trying to print it and send it to other people, and eventually these copies end up in the hands of the Pope himself and also end up in the hands of a lot of other different priests and even some princes within the Holy Roman Empire, right? Some leaders, some electors, some well-to-do, kingly type people in the Holy Roman Empire. They end up with all the copies of this 95 Theses. So here's the thing. Erasmus's ideas spread very quickly because of the printing press, right? So Martin Luther's did the same thing, okay? Martin Luther's ideas spread like wildfire, whereas Jan Hus's did not, and the Catholic Church had enough time to snuff him out. So the printing press and its invention is pivotal to the spread of the Renaissance, right? You need to jot that down. It is pivotal to the spread of the Renaissance. Without the printing press, his ideas would have never made it out there, right? And so a lot of these documents end up in the hands of the Pope. And the Pope, even at one point in 1519, calls him in front, and he calls him down to Rome, and he's like, look, come to Rome and we'll discuss your ideas, just like they did to Jan Hus before they burned him at the stake. And he refused to go there. And he's like, I'm not doing that. Heck no. I'm not going in front of the Pope and like listening to you tell me how I'm wrong. So he actually refused to do it. And so the Pope is like, all right, you want to start a fight? You want to start a fight then? So the Pope starts to gather a bunch of copies of the 95 Theses, and he starts putting them all together, and he starts creating all this big mass of like all these 95 Theses, and then he starts burning them in Rome, right? He starts burning copies and having book burnings of like the big things that Martin Luther was writing. And you know what? Like then he writes a letter to Martin Luther, and he's like, you need to stop. You need to stop doing what you're doing. You need to calm down. You need to chill out, and you need to listen to what your Pope is saying. And then Martin Luther says, well, you burned the copies of my documents, so you know what? And he burns that copy of the Pope's letter as well in front of people. And this is starting to gain him way more success, and he's starting to get heard way faster, right? And a lot of German-speaking people start jumping on the Luther bandwagon, especially a lot of the princes of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this is key, all right? So the Holy Roman Empire princes start listening to Luther, and they start jumping on his ideas, mainly because if the Pope is losing power, that means secular authorities are gaining it, right? Power kind of swings like a pendulum. And so the leaders of the Holy Roman Empire start realizing, well, if the Pope's losing power, that means that I'm getting more of that power, right? So that's a very huge pivotal swing. And then Martin Luther starts to issue pamphlets, right? Oh. So some of y'all are like, what's the big deal about a pamphlet? Well, the pamphlet war is really important because Martin Luther starts to basically fight with literature with the Catholic Church and the Pope himself. He starts having all these pamphlets printed out, and he starts handing them out to people, right? And then people start seeing that, like, oh, man, his ideas are pretty strong. He's saying that you don't necessarily need a priest to have God's grace. He's saying that, like, lay people and priests are pretty much the same. He's saying that the Pope's being a bad person right now, right? So it was called the pamphlet war because then the Pope starts issuing his own pamphlets, and then the pamphlets start going flying back and forth. And it all culminates eventually in 1521 to this thing called the Diet of Worms. All right, so it's not the Diet of Worms. It's not like, you know, I handed Kylie Sabito a couple worms and I was like, drink it! You know, like, so that's not how it works, okay? Worms is a city, all right? So, and it's pronounced Worms because it's a German city and they do not pronounce W's like we do, okay? So they would say the Diet of Worms, all right? So, or the Diet of Wittenberg or Was ist das, right? So, like, what is this, okay? So the Diet of Worms is very important because Luther is getting called not before the Pope. Go ahead and scribble out Pope. He's being called before the Holy Roman Emperor himself, right? The extension of the Pope. The man that the Pope says is in charge of the Holy Roman Empire because the Holy Roman Empire is kind of like a puppet state of the Catholic Church, right? And that guy's name is Charles V. He's a Habsburg, right? So, and he calls him before his council, and they have a lot of cardinals there and huge bishops and church officials. And Charles V says, take back your ideas. Take them back. Stop saying these things. And he absolutely refused to do that. This is my AP presentation from way back in the day. As you can see, it's like full of like really Cadillac stuff and like really intense things. But there's a great quote that I want to make sure that you hear. Where'd it go? This is depth of the quarter, bro. All right, so here we go. And at that meeting, Martin Luther said this. Martin Luther said when Charles V told him to take back his ideas, he said, unless I am convinced by evidence of Scripture or by plain reason, I cannot and will not recant anything, for it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. So he just dropped the mic very, very, very hard right in front of the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the man who was in charge of his safety and livelihood. And after the Diet of Worms, because he refused to take back his ideas, he was declared an outlaw, and all of his writings were condemned and placed on the Catholic Church's list of banned books, right? So unintentionally, he has now just started a new type of faith, right? So he did not do this on purpose. A lot of people actually argue, they're like, oh, well, you know, Luther wanted to, like, actually, like, start this church. No, originally he had planned on being Catholic. He just wanted to see change, right? But when he realized that no change was coming, then, of course, the very first Protestant faith was started, known as Lutheranism, right? So while Luther is creating, like, his new Protestant church, and while it's growing, he goes on the run, right? So he goes on the run because he knows for a fact that if he gets caught by Catholic authorities, they will probably put him to death. So he goes on the run. And it was actually good timing to go on the run as well, because in 1521, when the Diet of Worms was called, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, was busy having wars with other people, right? He was having a war with the French, and he was having a war with several other different countries and several other different groups of people. So it made it hard for him to focus on finding Luther when he had to focus on fighting a war, right? So Luther was able to stay on the run, and he was underground for like over 2 years. And the reason why is because those princes of the Holy Roman Empire, the ones that were the direct step underneath the emperor himself, were the ones that gave him shelter, right? They were the ones that hid him. They were the ones that allowed him to live in their homes and actually evade capture. And then in this hiding, he starts to grow his idea of a faith, and he starts to create the constructs of the Lutheran Church, and he starts translating the Bible into vernacular language, right? He translates the Bible into German, okay? So jot that down. Translate it into the German. That's a huge deal, right? So, and he then went back into some of his old letters, and he remembered when he was a professor, before any of this ever broke out, before he ever wrote the 95 Theses, he actually boiled his beliefs down into 3 key things. Grace alone, faith alone, Scripture alone, right? Now, we need to explain these things really quick. Grace alone is the idea that God and the grace of God are the things that get you to salvation. Not a list of sacraments, and not priests involved in the church. Now, look, I'm reporting this to you. I am not poking fun at any current church constructs of anything. I am just explaining to you what Lutherans during the 1500s believed, okay? That's it, okay? So before anybody says, Mr. Terry is being mean, no, he's not. He's just reporting, okay? So anyway, now, according to Luther, grace alone is the idea that God and the force of God is what gets you into heaven, not people involved in a church nor priests, right? So faith alone is another really, really big one as well. Faith alone is the idea, again, that God knows your soul and knows like how faithful you truly are, so you do not need to report to a priest or to a secular authority to make this happen. Let's give an example of the faith alone premise. The biggest thing about the faith alone is the transubstantiation debate. All right, so transubstantiation, which is still to this day a very, very amazingly cool Catholic belief, right? The idea that through a priest, the powers and focus of God are run through the bread and the wine, and it actually turns into the physical body and blood of Christ through a beautiful church ceremony. That is what transubstantiation is, right? That this bread has been turned into the bread, or excuse me, the body and the blood of Christ, right? It has been a belief since the Middle Ages, and it is still to this day currently a belief in the Catholic Church, which is an amazingly cool belief, right? So now, according to Protestants, particularly Lutherans, though, mainly just Lutherans, they don't believe it's like that. They believe that at no point was the bread and the wine turned into the body and blood of Christ, that Christ and like God were constantly present in it, right? So that's just a good example of the faith alone debate, the concept that like your faith in the bread and the wine made it the body and the blood of Christ, not someone being a part of the ceremony itself, right? So that's just an example of the faith alone debate, right? That it's the faith in God, not necessarily the practice or the going through certain steps to actually receive the faith portion, right? So the transubstantiation debate is very important, though. Go ahead and jot that down. Now, then the last one, though, is the controversial one at the time in the 1500s, where he said Scripture alone, which is like if you have problems and you want to seek counsel, go read the Bible. Well, if you got to be able to read the Bible, that means that you have to have the Bible translated into a lot of different languages away from the Latin, which is what it always had been before Luther himself, right? So then Luther is going to stay in hiding, and as of the 1560, his new faith pattern is going to start to spread. Luther also is going to advocate for a couple other things. Jot these down. As you can tell, like, he believed that that lay people and priests have the same kind of power and ideas, and there's no real true difference between them. He also advocated for the ideas of, priests were allowed to get married in the Lutheran church, which is a big deal because Luther himself actually went out and got married after the Lutheran faith began to get started. And they also were very, very against some other stuff. They were very, very against like a lot of different things, actually. Like certain constructs within cities and stuff like that. They were very against them, very outspoken against them. And like his ideas are going to begin to spread, and eventually Luther dies of old age in the 1560s, I believe. So let me see, Martin Luther. When does he die? I think it's 1560. Oh no, died in 1546, right? So in 1546 he eventually ends up dying. And no, I'm thinking of John Calvin dies in the 1560s. Now, so in 1546, he eventually ends up dying, but he dies not from an inquisition nor being put to the death. He dies from old age and after his faith began to spread rapidly, right? So there's a lot of other crazy stuff that happened as well. Like his ideas are going to lead to some wars and some rebellions, which we'll talk about in another flip later, or in another unit later on. Because right now we're just talking about the Reformation in general, and then when we get to absolutism, we'll talk about like religious warfare and how that gave a lot of power to a lot of different kings and stuff like that, right? So there's that, and that is it. That's the flip for this weekend. On the next couple flips, we're going to be talking about John Calvin and his ideas and how the Reformation is going to spread that way as well. But I'll see you guys later. Y'all have a good one.